The afternoon sun was warm, but not harsh. The kind of daylight that felt gentle on the skin of an older man who had grown used to quiet walks. Mr. Howard moved at his own slow pace, a brown paper grocery bag tucked carefully against his chest. He had lived in the same neighborhood for nearly 20 years, long enough that most of the locals recognized him, even if they didn't know his full story. He preferred it that way. He liked simple routines, simple days, the feeling of being left alone in peace. He had just picked up a few things from the small store on the corner: tea, bread, and a few apples, nothing heavy, but enough that he held the bag steady with both hands so it wouldn't slip. His left knee, hurt long ago in service, always made walking a little slower than he wished. Some days it behaved, some days it reminded him of things he didn't talk about anymore. Today it was behaving, and he silently thanked it for that. As he walked down the quiet sidewalk, he heard cars passing by on the nearby street, the distant hum blending with the sounds of kids playing somewhere behind the row of houses. It was a normal afternoon, peaceful, nothing unusual. He didn't know that a few streets away, someone had called the police about a suspicious man seen wandering slowly around the block. The caller didn't have details, only a vague description: an older man with a bag, moving strangely, looking around too much. The kind of call officers couldn't simply ignore. Mr. Howard didn't notice the patrol car turning into the street behind him. He was focused on walking without letting his knee buckle. He didn't notice the officers inside, sharing a brief look, wondering if he might be the person mentioned in the call. From the back, he looked like someone struggling to walk slow steps, stiff posture. To the officers, it didn't look like a casual stroll. He only became aware of something unusual when he heard the quick sound of tires stopping. He turned his head slightly but kept his steps steady. He was used to moving slowly and never liked sudden movements that might throw him off balance. The officers got out of the car, one standing near the door, the other taking a few steps forward. They called out to him, asking him to stop. Mr. Howard did stop, but not instantly. He eased himself to a still position, one foot planted carefully, making sure his knee didn't twist the wrong way. To him, he was simply moving carefully. To the officers, it looked like hesitation. One officer raised his voice a bit, telling him to put down the bag. Mr. Howard didn't understand why. The groceries were fragile and he didn't want to drop anything. He tried to explain that he needed a second, but his voice came out quieter than he expected. He wasn't a loud man. Age had softened his tone over the years. Sometimes people mistook that for weakness or uncertainty. The officers exchanged another uneasy look. They weren't angry, but they were cautious. Calls like this often turned into nothing. But training made them treat every situation seriously. Mr. Howard raised one hand very slowly, trying to show them he meant no harm, but the officer closest to him misunderstood the gesture, thinking he might be reaching into his coat. That was when the officer at the car made a decision. He moved to the back door, opened it, and gave a command. A trained canine stepped out, alert, focused, and ready to act. The dog's ears were up, eyes locked on the older man who stood completely still, unsure what was happening. People across the street noticed the sudden tension. A few neighbors who had been sitting outside on porches stood up. Some pulled out their phones. They didn't know the details, but they saw an elderly man being approached by a canine unit, and that alone was enough to draw attention. Mr. Howard kept his eyes on the dog. He had seen dogs like this before, long ago, in a different uniform, in a different life. For a moment, something deep inside him stirred an old memory, a familiar feeling he hadn't felt in years. But he stayed still, knowing that sudden movement could make things worse. He didn't want anyone, not even himself, to get hurt. The canine handler called out another command. The dog moved forward, not running yet, but walking with firm, confident steps, muscles tight, posture trained. The officers expected the dog to follow through, to do what it had been trained to do. The neighbors watching held their breath. Mr. Howard simply stood there with his grocery bag held tight against his chest. His calmness surprising even himself. The dog suddenly picked up speed, switching from a walk to a full sprint. People gasped. A woman nearby covered her mouth, bracing for a terrible sight. The officers didn't shout again. They trusted the dog to do its job. But in Mr. Howard's eyes, something softened, almost as if he was looking not at a threat, but at an old memory running back toward him. He felt an old instinct rising, something he thought he had forgotten. He didn't move. He didn't step back. He simply kept his posture steady, his breathing even, and his eyes locked with the approaching canine. The moment stretched, heavy and full of tension, just as the dog reached him. Mr. Howard exhaled slowly, almost in a whisper. It was barely a sound, hardly noticeable, but something in the dog reacted. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't confusion. It was recognition, or something close to it. The dog slowed down so quickly that even the handler took a surprised half-step forward. Mr. Howard stood completely still as the canine came to a stop, only inches away from him. Instead of jumping, instead of barking, instead of attacking, the dog simply lowered its head and stared at him. The crowd watching fell silent all at once. Even the officers didn't speak. The canine sniffed the air once, leaned a bit closer, and then did something no one expected. It sat down. Mr. Howard kept his hands where they were. He didn't reach out, not yet. He could feel the eyes of everyone around him. The dog stayed still, calm, waiting in a way that felt strangely respectful. The officer holding the leash called the dog's name and issued a command. But the dog didn't move. It didn't look back. It didn't obey. It simply remained seated at the man's feet. Watching him with quiet familiarity, Mr. Howard lowered his gaze to the dog, something softening in his expression. For a fleeting second, he looked younger, not in his face, but in the way he carried himself, like someone remembering a part of life he had tucked away years ago. The dog's breathing slowed, matching his pace. As if the two had fallen into an old rhythm, people in the crowd began whispering. Some were confused, some relieved. A few were angry that it had escalated this far, but most were simply stunned at how quickly the situation had changed. The officer nearest to Mr. Howard took a cautious step forward, unsure how to proceed. The dog ignoring commands was unusual, enough to make even trained officers hesitate. Mr. Howard finally spoke, his voice steady but gentle. He told them he wasn't a threat. He simply needed time to move because of his knee. He explained that he couldn't drop the grocery bag quickly without risking everything falling to the ground. The officers listened, but their eyes kept drifting back to the dog as if trying to figure out what had gone wrong. The handler tried again, using a firmer tone, but the canine still didn't move. Mr. Howard looked down at the dog again, and something unspoken seemed to pass between them. No one knew yet what it meant. No one understood why the canine had reacted this way. All they knew was that the moment the dog sat down, the entire situation shifted. The tension lifted. The danger faded. The crowd's fear turned into curiosity. Mr. Howard adjusted his grip on the grocery bag and stood as still as ever, waiting patiently, ready to speak when they allowed him to. The officers realized they needed to take a different approach now, one that didn't involve commands or force. And as the canine continued to sit loyally by the older man's feet, everyone watching felt the same quiet question forming in their minds. How did an elderly stranger calm a trained police dog in seconds without saying a single clear command? No one had the answer yet, but the truth was about to unfold in ways none of them expected. The moment the dog sat down in front of Mr. Howard, the entire street seemed to fall into a strange kind of silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of an empty neighborhood. This one was heavy, thick with confusion and disbelief. People who had been whispering slowly lowered their phones. Some stepped a little closer, careful not to disturb anything, as if they were watching something delicate unfold. Mr. Howard stood as still as before, but inside he felt the shift. He could sense the dog's calm energy, the same calm he had worked with long ago. He didn't know why this particular dog reacted the way it did, but he didn't want to make any sudden movements that might change things. The officer holding the leash tried again to call the dog's name, this time with a sharper tone. Usually, that tone meant the dog should correct itself and follow the command without question. But the canine didn't even turn its head. Instead, it stayed focused on Mr. Howard, sitting upright with its ears forward, tail resting gently on the ground. More people from nearby houses started coming out, drawn by the tension in the air. A man watering his lawn across the street turned off the hose to watch. Two teenagers on bikes rolled to a stop near the curb. A woman carrying her toddler held him closer, unsure whether to stay or go back inside. But no one left. Instead, the crowd slowly grew, forming a loose circle at a safe distance. Mr. Howard watched the officers carefully. He could see their uncertainty, the subtle shift in their posture now that the dog wasn't behaving as expected. He didn't blame them for being cautious. He knew what the world looked like from their perspective. He had worked with teams not so different from them many years ago. One of the officers finally spoke, asking Mr. Howard to slowly set the grocery bag on the ground. The man nodded gently, understanding why they wanted it. He shifted the bag slightly, then lowered it bit by bit until it rested on the sidewalk with a soft rustle. The dog didn't move. It followed the motion with its eyes, but didn't react with concern. Nearby, someone whispered, "How's the dog not doing anything?" "It was about to run him over a second ago," another person replied quietly. "Maybe he knows the guy." The canine handler stepped a little closer, stopping a few feet behind the dog. His hand tightened on the leash, but not forcefully, more like he was preparing for something he didn't fully understand. He called the dog again, gently this time, as if hoping the softer tone would break whatever strange connection had formed. But once again, nothing changed. Mr. Howard looked briefly at the officer, then down at the dog. The dog blinked slowly, a sign of relaxation, not aggression. It was almost as if it was waiting for him to do something, say something, like an unspoken invitation. He didn't speak yet. He didn't want to break the moment too quickly, not without the officer's permission. The last thing he wanted was for them to think. He was trying to take control of the dog. The officer closest to him took a step forward. "Sir," he said in a steady voice, "did you do something to the dog?" Mr. Howard shook his head gently. "I didn't move, officer. I just stayed still." The officer frowned slightly. "But it's like he knows you." Mr. Howard let out a soft breath, his eyes briefly showing a kind of tired understanding. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "dogs listen to things we don't hear." The handler gave the leash another light pull. "Come," he commanded firmly. The dog lifted its ears but remained seated. Someone in the crowd whispered, "That dog never disobeys. I've seen it at the park doing drills." Another voice chimed in, "Then why won't it move now?" No one had an answer. The handler exchanged a glance with the other officer, silently asking for guidance. The situation wasn't dangerous anymore, but it was definitely unusual. A trained canine refusing commands in front of a crowd wasn't something that happened every day. They needed to figure out what was going on without making the situation worse or more confusing. Finally, the officer standing nearest to Mr. Howard lowered his voice and asked, "Sir, can you tell us why you were moving so slowly earlier?" Mr. Howard nodded slightly. "My knee," he said simply. "Old injury. I can't rush." The officer's expression softened a bit. "We got a call about someone acting suspicious. We weren't sure what we were walking into." "I understand," Mr. Howard replied. "I wasn't trying to scare anyone. I was just trying not to fall." One person in the crowd murmured, "He walks like that every day." Another added, "Yeah, he's always got that same bag from the store." Their voices carried, reaching the officer's ears. Their posture eased slightly as they realized the man in front of them wasn't a threat. Still, the presence of the canine not responding to commands kept the tension from fully fading. The handler took a slow breath and tried again, this time stepping beside the dog and giving a more direct command. "Heel." Nothing. The dog didn't even twitch. Instead, it looked up at Mr. Howard again, as if waiting for some silent approval. Mr. Howard hesitated, then looked at the handler. "May I speak?" he asked politely. The handler blinked, surprised by the request. "Speak?" "To the dog," Mr. Howard clarified. The officers exchanged puzzled looks. The handler shrugged lightly, unsure what else to do. "Go ahead, I guess. But please don't touch him yet." Mr. Howard nodded. He slowly lowered himself onto one knee, as good knee so. He was closer to the dog's eye level. The crowd gasped quietly, worried the sudden change in height might trigger a reaction. But the dog leaned forward just a little, not aggressively, more like curiosity pulling him closer. In a soft voice, almost like a whisper of memory, Mr. Howard spoke to the dog. He didn't give a command. He didn't use any special word. He just said, "Easy now." The dog's entire body relaxed. Its shoulders softened. Its tail moved once against the sidewalk, slow and gentle. The handler's eyes widened. "Did you train him before?" The handler asked, confusion mixing with disbelief. Mr. Howard shook his head. "No, but I used to train dogs a long time ago." The crowd reacted quietly, a few people saying they had no idea, others whispering that it made sense now. The officer stood there trying to connect the dots. Mr. Howard placed his hand gently on his knee, lifting himself back up slowly. As he rose, the dog stood up with him, matching his movement naturally, as if the two had practiced the motion together for years. The handler tugged the leash again, but the dog resisted subtly, not with stubbornness, but with a kind of quiet loyalty. It stayed beside the older man, leaning slightly toward him. The officer who had first called out to Mr. Howard finally stepped forward again. "Sir, do you mind telling us what you mean by used to train dogs?" Mr. Howard hesitated, not because he wanted to hide anything, but because he hadn't spoken about that chapter of his life in a very long time. He looked around at the faces watching him, officers, neighbors, strangers, and then he looked down at the dog still standing calmly by his leg. He spoke softly, choosing each word with care. "I worked with dogs in the service many years ago," he said. "Different place, different time. We worked with trust, not fear. The dogs remembered people by their spirit, not by their clothes or their age." The handler frowned slightly, intrigued. "But how would this one recognize you?" Mr. Howard shook his head. "He doesn't recognize me. He recognizes the calm, the breathing, the stillness. Dogs like him are trained to read the person in front of them, and they remember things even we forget." A few people in the crowd nodded slowly, as if the explanation somehow made sense even if it felt unbelievable. The officer lowered his radio and stepped back, realizing the situation had shifted into something more complicated than a simple call. This wasn't about danger anymore. It was about understanding. As Mr. Howard reached down slowly and picked up his grocery bag again, the dog didn't move away. It took one step closer, almost protectively, as if making sure he had his balance. More whispers rippled through the crowd. "Why is he standing next to him like that?" "It's like he's guarding him now. That dog wouldn't even sit when the handler told him to earlier." The officers exchanged glances again. They needed a supervisor now, someone who could make sense of this from a procedural standpoint. One officer stepped aside to call it in. The handler kept his eyes on the dog and then on Mr. Howard. "Sir," said quietly, "whatever you did, it's like he trusts you more than me right now." Mr. Howard looked down at the dog with a gentle expression. "Dogs trust honesty," he replied, "and I wasn't afraid of him." The handler nodded slowly, still unsure, but unable to deny what he was seeing. The dog's loyalty at that moment was unmistakably and strange. People continued watching, waiting for what would happen next. The air felt different now, not thick with tension, but filled with a kind of awe. Everyone standing there knew they were witnessing something rare, something that didn't fit into the usual rules of the world. And as the supervisor's car finally turned onto the street, lights flashing but siren off, the dog remained where it was, right beside the elderly man it had been sent to confront just minutes earlier. No one could have predicted what was about to unfold next when the supervisor's vehicle rolled quietly onto the street. The crowd instinctively parted a little, creating a small path without being asked. People didn't want to block anything, but they also didn't want to miss what was happening. Everyone could feel that this moment was important, though no one could quite explain why. It wasn't just about a dog sitting instead of following a command. It was the way the canine stood next to Mr. Howard. It's almost like an old friend rather than a trained officer's partner. The supervisor stepped out of the car carefully, taking in the scene before speaking. He saw the gathered neighbors, the two officers, the canine handler, and then finally the elderly man standing quietly with a grocery bag in one hand and a patient expression on his face. But it was the canine's behavior that made him pause. The dog wasn't tense. It wasn't alert. It wasn't pulling toward anything. It was simply standing close to the older man, as if that was where it naturally belonged. The supervisor walked over with slow, steady steps. He didn't raise his voice or jump to conclusions. Instead, he asked the officers in a calm tone, "What's going on here?" The handler was the first to answer. He explained briefly how the call had come in, how they had approached the man, how the dog had been released with a command to engage, and how everything had shifted the moment the dog reached him. He didn't exaggerate anything. He didn't try to make excuses. He simply said what had happened. Though even he struggled to fully describe the strange behavior, the supervisor listened without interrupting. He studied the dog closely, noticing the relaxed posture and the way it occasionally looked up at Mr. Howard, as if waiting for some kind of silent instruction. That alone was unusual. Canine officers were trained to respond to their handlers, not strangers. When the supervisor finally turned to Mr. Howard, he spoke with respect rather than suspicion. "Sir, are you all right?" he asked. Mr. Howard nodded gently. "I'm fine, thank you." "Did the dog make contact with you at any point? Did he jump or try to bite?" the supervisor asked. "No," Mr. Howard said softly. "He stopped on his own." The crowd murmured at those words. Some of them had seen exactly what happened. Others had arrived moments after and were still piecing things together. But everyone knew that dogs didn't simply decide to stop on their own. When given a direct order, the supervisor turned his attention back to the handler. "And he didn't respond to any of your commands?" The handler shook his head. "Not a single one." The supervisor nodded slowly, absorbing the information. He was experienced enough to know that dogs made mistakes sometimes, just like people. But this didn't look like a mistake. This looked deliberate. He stepped closer to the dog and crouched slightly, watching its eyes. The dog glanced at him briefly, acknowledging his presence, but then turned back to Mr. Howard. The supervisor raised his eyebrows. "Sir," the supervisor said, directing his voice to the older man, "did you give the dog any signal? Even something small?" Mr. Howard hesitated for a moment, not wanting to sound dramatic or strange. "No command," he said quietly. "Just calm." One of the teenagers on the sidewalk whispered to his friend. "He didn't even move." "How did the dog know?" His friend whispered back, "Maybe the dog just liked him." Dogs can tell when someone's good. Mr. Howard glanced at the dog again, seeing the soft look in its eyes. He had known dogs like this during his service, intelligent, loyal, perceptive. They could sense things people missed. The supervisor stood up straight again. "Sir, would you mind telling me a little about your background?" Mr. Howard nodded slowly. "I worked with service dogs many years ago," he said. "Not on the police side, but in the military. We trained them for search work, protection, and support." The handler raised his eyebrows in surprise. "You train dogs like him?" "Different training," Mr. Howard replied, "but the principles were the same. Trust, consistency, staying calm." The supervisor cleared his throat gently. That might explain why the dog reacted the way he did. Canine South responds strongly to energy and posture. Mr. Howard nodded again. "Yes, they remember things we think they forget. Even the way someone breathes." The handler stared at the dog, still confused. But why him? Why now? Mr. Howard lowered his eyes for a moment, thinking. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "dogs can sense a familiar heart, even if they've never met it before." The crowd fell silent again, not because they fully understood, but because the words felt meaningful. The supervisor took a slow breath. "Well, at the very least, you handled yourself very calmly. That probably helped." Mr. Howard nodded humbly. "I just didn't want anyone getting hurt, especially the dog." Somebody in the crowd said softly, "Look at that. He's more worried about the dog than himself." The supervisor looked at the grocery bag still in Mr. Howard's hand. "Sir, may I ask what you were doing before all this happened?" "Just walking home," Mr. Howard said. "My knee slows me down, so it takes me a little longer." Around them, a few neighbors nodded, confirming that the older man always took slow steps. The supervisor noticed the way the bystanders defended him without being asked. that said something about the man's character. The supervisor then addressed the officers. "We need to clear this up. Clearly he's not the suspect," and the situation escalated because of a misunderstanding. The officers nodded, accepting the correction without defensiveness. They had acted based on the information they had at the time, but the issue of the dog still remained. The handler crouched beside his partner and gave another command, softer than before. The dog twitched, but didn't move its feet. Instead, it leaned slightly closer to Mr. Howard. The handler frowned and looked up at the supervisor. "I've never seen him act like this," he said quietly. The supervisor nodded. "Maybe let Mr. Howard try something." The handler looked unsure. "Like what?" "Ask the dog to step back," the supervisor said. "See if he listens to him." The handler hesitated, but eventually nodded. "Sir," he said to Mr. Howard, "would you mind trying to get him to move?" Mr. Howard didn't rush. He set down his grocery bag again, carefully, then looked at the dog with a soft expression. He didn't tower over him or make himself dominant. Instead, he stood in a relaxed, respectful posture. He kept his voice low when he spoke. "Back up," he said gently. The dog didn't hesitate. It took 2 steps backward, its gaze never leaving the older man. The handler's jaw dropped. The supervisor blinked in disbelief. The crowd rippled with soft gasps and quiet comments. Mr. Howard didn't smile. He didn't boast. He simply nodded to the dog, the same way he might have nodded to a longtime companion. The supervisor looked at the handler. "It seems the dog responds to him." Handler exhaled, still processing everything. "It shouldn't be possible," he muttered, "but here we are." The supervisor took a few steps back, giving everyone more space. The atmosphere was no longer tense, but it was still full of curiosity. People wanted to know more. They had never expected to see an elderly man and a police dog interacting like this. One of the neighbors stepped forward slightly, raising her voice just enough. "Maybe the dog knows he's a veteran," she said. "Animals feel things," another person agreed quietly. "Yeah, they sense respect." Supervisor turned back to Mr. Howard. "Sir, thank you for helping calm things down. We're very grateful." Mr. Howard shook his head gently. "I didn't do much." The supervisor gave a faint smile. "You did more than you think." The handler tried again with another command now that the dog had stepped back. "Sit," he said firmly. The dog sat, but its eyes stayed locked on Mr. Howard, not on the handler. The handler rubbed his forehead, half amused, half frustrated. "This is unbelievable." Mr. Howard stepped a little closer to the dog, then looked at the handler to make sure he wasn't crossing any lines. The handler nodded slightly, giving him silent permission to approach. With slow movements, Mr. Howard knelt down once more, letting his weight rest gently on his good knee. He lifted a hand slowly, letting the dog sniff it first. The dog leaned forward without hesitation, pressing its head lightly into the man's hand. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't anxious. It was affectionate. A sound rippled through the crowd's soft ahs, surprised gasps, quiet sighs of relief. Even the officers exchanged looks filled with amazement. The supervisor approached again. "Sir, would you mind telling us what you said to him earlier?" Mr. Howard shook his head. "I didn't give a command," he answered. "I just reminded him to be calm inside. Dogs understand that. They understand peace." The supervisor studied him for a long moment, as if trying to understand how a man could carry so much calmness in the middle of such confusion. The officers seemed to feel it too. It wasn't just the dog responding to him. It was everyone. The handler gently tapped the leash, signaling for the dog to return to his side. The dog obeyed this time, but slowly, as if reluctant to leave the man's presence. When it reached the handler, it sat once again, still watching Mr. Howard. The supervisor took a quiet breath. "Well," he said softly, "we need to get a full report on this. But for now, I think it's clear there's no threat here." A wave of relief washed over the crowd. Some people even clapped quietly, not in celebration, but in appreciation that the moment had ended safely. Mr. Howard picked up his grocery bag again. His knee ached a little from kneeling twice, but he didn't complain. He simply steadied himself. The supervisor walked closer. "Sir, do you need help getting home?" Mr. Howard shook his head politely. "No, thank you. I'll be fine." The handler stepped forward almost shyly. "Sir, if you have a moment after things settle, I'd like to ask you more about how you worked with dogs. I've never seen anything like this." Mr. Howard nodded gently. "I'd be happy to talk." The dog let out a soft sound, a small huff through its nose as if agreeing. People laughed quietly at the timing, and as the officers began clearing the area and reassuring the neighbors, the question on everyone's mind grew stronger. Why did the dog act like he already knew them? The following afternoon carried a strange mix of calm and tension. The town seemed quieter than usual, like everyone was waiting to see what would happen next after that moment with the police canine. People who had seen the event kept, now talking about it in small groups, sharing their own versions of the story. Some exaggerated it, some softened it. But all of them agreed on one thing: nobody expected a police dog to react the way that one did. The elderly veteran, however, spent most of that day trying to avoid all the attention. He was a simple man. He did not like crowds, and he definitely didn't enjoy being the center of any story. But everywhere he went, someone stopped him to ask if he was all right, or to say they heard what happened. He would give a small smile, a polite nod, and then move on. The truth was, he didn't mind people checking on him. He just didn't know how to handle so much sudden interest. He had lived a quiet life since his retirement, and that suited him well. The events of the previous day had shaken him more than he allowed others to see. What bothered him wasn't the officer. It wasn't even the rush of the moment. What lingered in his mind was the dog, the way the canine approached him calmly, the way it sat beside him like it already knew him, the way it ignored the command that was supposed to make it attack. He had seen trained dogs before, many years ago, but he had never seen one behave like that. As evening came closer, he sat outside his home on a wooden chair he had fixed many times over the years. The sun painted warm colors over the sky, and he felt a soft breeze against his face. It was peaceful, but he knew that the peace wouldn't last long. Something inside him whispered that the story wasn't over yet. A knock on his door broke the quiet moment. When he turned, he found the same young officer from the day before standing on his porch. The officer looked nervous, holding his cap in his hands. Behind him, sitting patiently, was the same canine. For a moment, the veteran wasn't sure what to think. He straightened slowly and walked toward them. "Sir," the officer said with a slow exhale, "this isn't an official visit. I just wanted to check on you, and I thought maybe I should let the dog see you again." The veteran looked at the dog, and the dog's tail moved just a little, like it recognized him. That small gesture warmed something inside him that had been quiet for a long time. "He's a good dog," the veteran said softly. "He's usually very strict with commands," the officer explained. "Yesterday, I've never seen him do anything like that. My supervisor wants to review his behavior, but I thought he deserved to see you again before anything happens." The veteran nodded and slowly extended his hand. The canine walked up and gently nudged his palm with its nose. It was a small moment, but somehow it felt bigger than the three of them. The officer let out a breath he had been holding. "Sir, if you're comfortable telling me, did something happen between you two before I arrived yesterday? Some people bond with dogs quickly, but this felt different." The veteran looked down at the dog and then back at the officer. He hesitated. There were parts of his past he didn't talk about anymore. Not because he was hiding anything, but because life had moved on. Still, something inside him said the truth needed to be shared. He motioned for the officer to sit, and they both took a seat on the wooden chairs on the porch while the canine sat beside the veteran's leg. "You know," the veteran began, "I worked with dogs a long time ago. Military dogs. I trained them, cared for them, and sometimes watched them go into danger with more courage than any human." The officer's eyes widened slightly. "You trained canine units." "Something like that." He gave a gentle smile. "Back then, those dogs weren't just animals. They were partners. They were family. After I retired, I thought I'd never feel that bond again. Yesterday, when your dog approached me, you could say it reminded me of a time I thought I had left behind." The officer nodded. Understanding a little more, He acted like he knew you, the officer said quietly. The veteran gently scratched the dog's head. Maybe he did. Dogs can sense things: calmness, fear, pain, even experience. The officer lowered his gaze. I'm sorry for how things happened yesterday. We misread the situation. You were doing your job, the veteran said calmly. And you learned something from it. That's what matters. The dog rested its head on the veteran's knee. The officer watched with quiet amazement. Double quote, sir, if it's all right with you. I want to understand more about how you worked with dogs. Maybe it can help me be better at my job, too. The veteran looked at him, surprised but appreciative of the sincerity. There's a lot to learn, the veteran said, and it doesn't start with commands. It starts with trust. The officer nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. They talked for a while. The veteran shared stories about dogs he had trained, dogs that saved lives, dogs that formed unbreakable bonds with their handlers. The officer listened closely, absorbing every word. Over time, the young man's nervousness faded. He felt safe asking questions, and the veteran felt comfortable giving answers. The dog stayed close the whole time, leaning occasionally against the veteran like it was choosing a place it belonged. After an hour passed, the sky grew darker. Sir, the officer finally said as he stood up, I'm grateful for your time. I'd like to come again if you're okay with it. You're welcome anytime, the veteran replied. Before leaving, the officer gently pat the dog. Come on, buddy. But the dog didn't move. Instead, it stayed right beside the veteran. The officer blinked in surprise. Hey, let's go. Still nothing. The veteran looked down at the dog, then back at the officer. There was a quiet moment where none of them knew what to say. Why is he staying? The officer asked softly. The veteran didn't answer right away. He placed a hand on the dog's back and felt the steady, calm breathing. Something deep inside him stirred something he hadn't felt for years. Maybe, the veteran said gently, he's trying to tell us something. The officer knelt down and looked into the dog's eyes. The dog's calm gaze didn't show fear or confusion, just certainty. He's never done this before, the officer said quietly. Then listen to him, the veteran replied. The officer stood slowly, unsure but trusting the moment. All right, the officer said finally. He can stay for a little while. The dog's tail moved lightly. The officer stepped off the porch and paused. I'll check in tomorrow. The veteran nodded. As the officer walked away, the dog stayed seated beside the veteran, calm and steady. The evening air felt different now, filled with something new, a quiet connection forming. Something the veteran didn't expect but somehow felt right. And as the stars began to appear in the sky, the veteran gently rubbed the dog's head and whispered, Looks like life isn't done surprising me. The next morning arrived quietly. The kind of calm that almost felt like the world was holding its breath. The veteran woke earlier than usual. He wasn't sure if it was because of the sunlight sneaking through the curtains or because he knew the day would bring something important. All he knew was that a certain heaviness and warmth lingered in his mind, the kind that only comes from moments that matter. He walked into the small kitchen, made himself a simple cup of tea, and sat by the window. As he looked outside, he noticed the street was unusually empty. Most mornings, neighbors passed by on their way to work or stopped to greet each other. Today, however, the road felt still. Maybe word had spread again. Maybe the town was waiting to see what would happen next. He took a slow sip and let the warmth settle. It felt good, calming, familiar. A soft sound suddenly came from his porch, a gentle scratch, like someone brushing against the wooden floorboards. His heart lifted in a quiet, unexpected way. He opened the door there. Sitting patiently at the edge of the porch was the same canine from the past 2 days. The dog looked up at him with calm eyes, tail tapping lightly against the floor. No barking, no jumping, just a warm, steady presence. You came back, the veteran whispered. The dog stepped closer and nudged his leg gently. The veteran knelt slowly, his knees stiff but steady, and rested a hand on the dog's head. A softness settled between them, something almost indescribable. Moments later, he heard footsteps approaching. The young officer from before appeared, holding his hat again. looking just as unsure as the first day, but with a bit more trust in his eyes. "Good morning, sir," the officer said. I thought I should check on him. And on you." The veteran smiled lightly. "We're both fine. He just got here." The officer nodded, though his expression held a quiet concern. "He slipped out of the training area earlier. Went straight toward this direction. I figured I'd find him here." The veteran scratched the dog's neck. He already made up his mind, it seems. The officer lowered his gaze. "Sir, I need to ask again. Do you think this connection between you two is something from his training, or something else?" The veteran didn't answer right away. He looked at the dog, then at the morning sky. "Some bonds just happen," he said softly. "You don't plan them. You don't train them. They just appear when they're meant to." The officer let out a slow breath, letting the words sink in. "Sir," he began carefully, "my supervisor wants to talk to you today. About everything that happened. Nothing bad, just clarification. He also wants to see how the dog behaves around you." The veteran nodded. "I expected that, if it's all right," the officer added. "I can give you a ride. They asked me to bring both of you." The veteran smiled at the phrasing. "Both of us. Like we're a team already." The officer shrugged with a small grin. "I guess the dog made that choice for us." The veteran stood, steadying himself. The dog stayed close, matching his pace. Together, the three of them walked to the patrol car parked near the sidewalk. The officer opened the rear door. "You can sit up front, sir. He'll sit in the back like usual." But when the officer guided the dog toward the back seat, the dog refused to move. Instead, it walked around the car and sat beside the front passenger door. The officer blinked. "He's never done that either," the veteran chuckled softly. "Seems he wants to stay close." The young officer hesitated, then sighed. "All right. Just for this ride?" Dog climbed into the front seat and settled comfortably, resting its head on the veteran's lap. The officer shook his head in disbelief as he started the engine. The drive to the police station was quiet, but peaceful. The veteran watched the town pass by through the window-familiar streets, small shops, neighbors walking their dogs. But this time, everything felt a little different. A little brighter. When they arrived, several officers were already outside, waiting. Some stood with arms crossed, others looked curious. A few even whispered among themselves when they saw the dog sitting calmly beside the veteran as they stepped out of the car. The station supervisor, a middle-aged man with a composed expression, approached them. "Good morning, sir," he said respectfully. "Thank you for coming. We want to make sure we handle this situation properly." "I understand," the veteran replied. The supervisor's eyes shifted to the dog. "Before we talk, may I ask, did he follow your command?" The veteran shook his head. "I didn't give him one. He just follows his own instinct around me." The supervisor exchanged glances with the canine handler standing nearby. The handler looked genuinely puzzled. "Let's talk inside," the supervisor said. They entered a large training room with open space and soft mats on the floor. The dog stayed close by the veteran's side. The officers formed a half circle, observing quietly. "Sir," the supervisor began, "just for documentation, could you tell us again what happened that first day? In your own words." The veteran gave a calm explanation. He described the moment the dog approached him, the stillness he felt, the bond that formed instantly. He didn't dramatize anything. He didn't blame anyone. He just spoke from the heart. The officers listened with respect. Then the supervisor nodded to the canine handler. "Let's test his response." The handler stepped forward and called the dog's name firmly. The dog didn't move. He repeated the command twice, louder each time, still nothing. The dog merely leaned a bit closer to the veteran. Soft murmurs echoed through the room. The veteran rested a calm hand on the dog's back. The supervisor noticed how the dog immediately relaxed. "Sir," the supervisor said carefully, "have you ever worked with this specific dog before?" The veteran shook his head. "Never. This is our first meeting." "And yet," the supervisor continued, "he reacts to you as if you're his handler." The veteran gave a quiet smile. Maybe he sees something familiar in me. Dogs don't need a history to trust someone. They need presence, calm, and understanding. The supervisor took a deep breath and looked at the officers around him. It's rare, very rare. But sometimes a dog chooses a person. The handler stepped forward. Sir, I've trained him for years. He follows every command. I mean every single one. Yesterday was the first time he didn't, and today, I've never seen him like this. The veteran reached down and gently scratched the dog's neck. The dog let out a content breath. The supervisor rubbed his forehead. We need to make a fair decision here. The dog's bond with you. It's strong. Stronger than anything we expected. But we can't force him to work if he won't follow instructions around anyone else when you're present. The veteran spoke softly. I'm not trying to take him away from anyone. I know, the supervisor replied. But the dog has already made that choice himself. A long silence filled the room. Finally, the supervisor looked up with a steady expression. Sir, we'd like to offer something. Not officially, not publicly. Just something that feels right. The veteran waited calmly. We'd like to let him spend time with you, regularly, for companionship, for training, for whatever this bond means. It's clear he trusts you more than anyone else. And honestly, it might even help our training program to understand this connection better. The officer beside him added quietly, He's happier with you than I've ever seen him. The veteran looked down at the dog, who stared back with gentle, trusting eyes. He felt something shift inside him, something both old and new, a purpose he thought he had left behind many years ago. If that's what you all think is best, he said softly, I'd be honored. The room seemed to relax immediately. Officers exchanged relieved glances. The handler nodded, understanding even though it was difficult. The young officer smiled openly for the first time. The dog's tail tapped the mat. The supervisor stood straighter. Then we'll arrange a schedule. And thank you, sir, for being patient with us and for reminding us what real connection looks like. The veteran lowered his gaze humbly. Thank you for trusting him. When they stepped outside, the sunlight felt brighter than it had in days. The young officer walked beside the veteran. Sir, he said, I hope you know this means the dog will want to see you a lot. The veteran chuckled. I figured that. The officer hesitated before adding, and I'd like to learn more from you too. If you're willing, the veteran paused. Surprised but touched. I'd be glad to help, he said. The dog walked between them, looking up at both men like it had brought them together on purpose as they headed toward the car. The veteran whispered to the dog, Looks like we both got a second chance, my friend. The dog nudged his hand gently, and for the first time in many years, the veteran felt something steady and full inside his chest, something like purpose, like belonging, like life opening. A door he didn't expect. It wasn't the dramatic ending people in town might have imagined, but it was real, quiet, human, and the kind of ending that wasn't really an ending at all. It was the beginning of something new.